let me just start with a little bit of my background and how I ended up getting connected to Marie and Olivier. So I'm a startup and venture capital lawyer in New York. And I ended up starting to do that work in the 90s. And I started teaching internet law and startup law in the 90s at law school. It was easy to teach because there was so little of it and so few of us doing it that whatever I got wrong, there were only like 5 people who would know. So that was nice. Things didn't go all that well a couple of years later, and I made a really important decision. Number one, I knew that in New York, we were at a distinct disadvantage relative to Northern California because the Bay Area, and at the time it was really only Silicon Valley, was where all of the venture capital was located for tech. I was in New York, and I decided that I needed to build a community because if you're worried, and I was having this conversation with another steward today, if you're worried about not being invited to the party, you must throw your own party. You must build the community and invite other people. We started our first event literally in March of 2000, the very day that NASDAQ evaporated. The event is called Venture Crush. We are still running Venture Crush events. We have Venture Crush Paris, we have Venture Crush Africa, we have Venture Crush San Francisco, we have them all over. And I think there are 7 of them this month that, and I'm not hosting any of them, although I just hosted one. So there are a lot of people now doing it, which has been great, and thousands of people go through. So one takeaway from that is if you're doing something important and you doubt that it's effective, keep doing it. But you have to believe that the period in which you are ineffective will ultimately end because you believe so strongly in it and you're working so hard at it that it makes sense to persist in the face of what looks a lot like failure. And I think that's important. We also had a values alignment issue. No strings attached. We never charged to start Venture Crush. We never charged to attend Venture Crush. And we wanted to be inclusive, diverse, and equitable. So we made outreach to groups for women entrepreneurs. We made outreach to lesbians who tech. We made outreach to Start Out, which was an LGBTQIA group for founders. We made outreach to Black women who code. We made outreach to all these groups, and we said, we want you to be part of our community, and we want to have the most inclusive and equitable and diverse events around because we think that's what the market should look like, and that's important to us. And I started investing alongside that thesis. So I'm an American. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and that means that I had a lot of student loans. I owed more than $100,000 when I got out of law school in 1992, and $100,000 in 1992 was a lot of money. I think it's like 2 cappuccinos in the 8th arrondissement now, but it was a lot of money back then. So it took years to pay that off, but because I was so early in doing startups in tech, I had the opportunity to angel invest in companies. And the market in New York was so pathetically poor that you could get into any deal that you wanted, and you could get any allocation in that deal that you wanted. And in fact, because my wife, Betsy, and I were investing even then with a diversity, equity, and inclusion thesis, which I'll come to in a minute, we really could get into any deal because really no one else was doing this. But that led to the creation of a differentiated network. And it turns out that if you're very vocal about the things that you believe in, you get passed around to other people who also believe those things, and you become somewhat polarizing. So in 2013, I published something in the Wall Street Journal complaining that venture capital in America was 89% white, 87% male, and that 52% of all venture capitalists in America at the time had degrees from only 10 schools. Now, I know that in France, you're so much more equitable about things that you wouldn't know anything about a white male-dominated venture industry that went to all the same grande école. That would never happen here because you wouldn't permit it after other problems that you've had here last century. Nonetheless, I did that, and I published a case study at Columbia because the internet did come back, and I had decided that everyone else was leaving venture capital and startups after the market crashed. On September 10th of 2001, in New York, I was the lawyer for two different startups that signed term sheets for venture capital. On September 11th, I watched the second plane hit the Twin Towers. I saw the markets freeze, and I understood that we were screwed. It was a terrifying time. But over time, I kept thinking, just stick with venture capital, just stick with startups. The possibilities of the internet are infinite. And everyone else is going to leave the market, and those of us who stick around will benefit. And I have felt the same way about my thesis on diversity, equity, and inclusion, because I also believe strongly that 2050 will actually get here. I believe strongly that climate change is actually going to have a meaningful effect, and people are going to feel really frickin' stupid that they didn't take action. And those actions include curbing the negative effect of climate change, but they also include the opportunity to align your wallet and your heart, because you can make money investing in preventing and monitoring and holding people accountable for climate change problems, just like you can in racial equity. And that goes to how I ended up meeting Marie. So you write a bunch of articles. I also made a pledge in the Wall Street Journal against gender bias. I got introduced to Marie, who was doing something with President Hollande at the time. And we realized that we had a lot in common, and I had this deep admiration for Marie, and I started coming to Paris. I was coming to Paris regularly because my wife and I had bought an apartment here, and I figured this would be a good excuse to get to spend time, get to know the venture community. Every VC I met in 2009, 2010, and I met all of them, 6, and they were all straight white guys. They had all gone to the same couple of schools, and they all talked about him. And they all took credit for what he was doing. And then in 2011, when you had the largest exit in venture capital in France and one of the largest exits in venture capital in Europe, and some of them returned 16 times their investment, they all had pictures of you in their offices. And now there were some more of them. And part of why there were more was because you were a seminal proof point in building the venture industry in France. You proved that even though the French government was going to stop foreign acquisitions, someone could make some money investing in a French company. That company would grow, and investors would get a huge return. And in short time, the two of you started France Digital and were co-presidents and didn't kill each other for like a decade, right? And France Digital has grown and grown and grown. So it's that building community and then sourcing deals from that community. So I invest as an angel investor. I've now invested in more than 170 companies, predominantly the US, Europe, and Africa. And I'm also an LP in funds, because as funds would come to New York from San Francisco or Boston or Europe, I was, like you said, you need people who are experienced, which is code for old. And no one else had been doing, everyone else who had been doing startups in New York in the 90s had exited that field long ago. I'm still standing, so I was decoding New York, and because I was hosting events and dinners, I was introducing them to members of the community. And I saw that Europe was undercovered by venture capitalists. Europe was undercovered by startup lawyers. And French people like to drink amazing wine. What could be better then starting to do our events in Paris. So I became a fixture here and spent a lot of time with these folks who really were proof points. As an LP, so my wife and I became LPs in more than 100 venture funds. And then we started our own fund of funds, and we've invested in another 90 venture capital funds across the globe. One of the things that we've seen, because the fund of funds called First Close Partners, and that's what these slides are, invests in venture funds owned by underrepresented investors. Black investors, LGBTQIA plus investors, women, for instance. And one of the things that we've seen is for a lot of them, they will start to build a community and then they'll get deals from that community. And the question is always, do we have proof points that indicate that they can pick the right deals? Because it's amazing to have the power to convene. And today you're seeing an example of the power to convene that 2050 has. But how do you know? How do you know you can pick the right deals? And for me, I look at metrics like MOIC. And MOIC is not some American word, it's an acronym, and it means multiple on invested capital. Marie, for instance, as a venture capitalist over the last 20 years or so, has returned almost 7 times the invested capital that she has deployed. In almost every single vintage of venture capital in the last 20 years, that would make Marie one of the top 10, 15 investors in venture capital in the world. It would make Marie one of the top 10% of all venture capitals in any one of those vintages. But to sustain that kind of metric over this long a period, this long a career through really shitty markets like 2008, that's extraordinary. And what we're looking for is not to give handouts, not to give charity, not to say, let's give underrepresented people money. We're looking to make a lot of fucking money. And so if you have the biggest exit and one of Europe's finest investors, most successful investors, mathematically most successful, I don't care if she tweets about it or whatever, and they've already worked together for a decade, why would you not think this is a great place to make money? And the reason you would think it's not a great place to make money is because the word impact scares the shit out of you. Because you think, not necessarily the people in this room, because a number of you are true believers, but you think that impact actually means you're going to screw up the dollars. And it doesn't. So if you turn to the back of this, there's a slide. And the slide says that there's research from 2019. That research was done by a woman named Jennifer Eberhardt. Jennifer Eberhardt is a PhD. She's a professor, and she's a professor at Stanford, which is one of the 10 magical schools that all the VCs went to. Jennifer Eberhardt doesn't look like all the VCs because she's black. She teaches at Stanford. She wrote an amazing book in 2017 called Biased, and she did this research in 2019. And the research was this. She took 4 venture capital funds, hypothetical venture capital funds, and she wrote a summary of each. She then told over 100 limited partners, the professional investors who for a living invest in venture funds, that they were doing an experiment to see how artificial intelligence could pick venture funds for LPs. And what she did was she made all 4 funds the same. They were raising a new fund. Each fund had 3 employees. The lead was a black male at 2 of the funds and a white male at 2 of the funds. 2 of the funds had high mathematical performance, not as high as Marie's, because that'd be freaking crazy, but high mathematical performance, and 2 of the funds were underperformers. She then took stock photos off the internet and put 2 random black men and 2 random white men on the page as the lead partners of each fund. And she rotated the photos. Now, she didn't tell the LPs she was assessing how racist they were, but that is in fact what she was doing. And what they learned was that the LPs were biased against the high-performing black managers. The LPs were biased in favor of the low-performing black managers. The LPs wouldn't give the low-performing black funds money, but they spoke very favorably of them. They really did not like the high-performing black-led funds. Here's what's worse, because that's bad enough, but here's what's worse. They then asked the LPs to evaluate their own skills as investors. The LPs, it's funny. The LPs, I mean, it's horrible, but it's funny. The LPs felt worse about themselves after evaluating the high-performing black managers, and they felt better about themselves after evaluating the low-performing, that's right, Marta, the low-performing black managers. And the conclusion, and this is Stanford's conclusion, number 1, LPs are too racist to actually effectively evaluate black managers and probably other underrepresented managers. Number 2, LPs like things to conform to their preconceived stereotypes. Now, what the Stanford report did not conclude, but this is my conclusion, please don't tell us we're not the master race. We really don't like hearing it. And so I mention this because I've been investing along a diversity, equity, and inclusion thesis. I do it because I genuinely believe it. I believe that there is a demographic shift. I believe that America will be majority non-white by 2040 or 2050. I believe that the purchasing power has shifted so that women make a lot of the purchasing decisions and people of color are going to deploy a lot of the purchasing dollars. And I believe that if 87% of all venture investors in America are male, and 89% of them are Caucasian, and 52% of them went to the same 10 schools, we can guess what the median income was in that group. They're going to have a narrower set of insights. And when the demography shifts and the purchasing power shifts, they are going to be left in the fucking dust. They're going to understand what rich people want to buy. They're not going to understand what the whole world wants. They're not going to understand what the whole world needs. And because my wife and I are just a little less racist than other LPs, we've done really well by investing in underrepresented venture funds for a decade. And that's basically what these slides say. So it can actually be part of your thesis that you're going to make a lot of money by investing on a thesis that you think is values aligned with who you are and with how you want the world to look. And someone was saying earlier, I invested in 2050 because I want to build a better world. I am still that poor kid from Brooklyn with a chip on my shoulder because I don't know what fork to use at dinner, because I don't know which bread plate is mine. That's a whole other story. I want to make a fuck ton of money. And I care deeply about with whom I make that money and how I make that money. And I get to sleep better at night knowing that I'm investing in underrepresented venture investors and founders, knowing that I'm investing in people I believe in, but also knowing that I put them through diligence. And I've looked at the numbers, and I've spoken to the founders, and I've spoken to the people who invested in your company and who co-invested with you. And I know that the two of you have been co-investing long before 2050. So the team dynamic is something that's also really important. So when people wince when you say we're an impact fund and start thinking we can't make money that way, I don't know. I've got a pretty nice apartment in Paris.
Thank you. I actually had a question which I wanted to ask you, but I think you kind of answered it with the example for Stanford, which is considering the case you're making with these numbers, why do you think the LP asset class as a whole is not following the same type of thesis?
Yeah, so there are a couple of answers to that, and I didn't provide my own numbers, but when I started this fund, I started it with Josh Koppelman, who's the founder of First Round Capital, which is one of the best venture funds in the world, and Teresa Gao, who started and runs another fund called Acrew. Teresa is the world's most Midas-listed woman. She's been on the list 9 times. She gave Facebook their A-round term sheet. She's made a lot of money in venture. And Dr. Regina Benjamin, who was the Surgeon General under President Obama, my wife, Betsy, who was an equity analyst at a fund, and PJ Parson, who is at North Zone, where I've been an advisor for years and an investor. In doing what we are doing, we talk to other LPs all the time because they're reference checking the funds that we've invested in. In a down market, and today we're in a down market, there's a flight to quality. But everyone defines quality differently. And a lot of people are going to define quality as went to Stanford, worked at Goldman Sachs. I have nothing against Stanford. I just sent them a tuition check because my daughter's in law school there. It's a great school. No problem with it. It's just not the only school. And if you think that a flight to quality is someone who went to the right prep school and then the right college and then worked at Goldman Sachs, you're never going to break out of the mold. If, on the other hand, you think that you can make an investment in a company that is going to fly medication by drone across Africa, like Betsy and I did several years ago, and that company's now worth several $billion, or you think that 2 people who've never worked on cancer data can work on cancer data, and Betsy and I did that as seed investors, and that company sold for over $2 billion a number of years ago. If you think outside the box, as we say in the States, you can make money, but you're depending on other people thinking inside the box because it's only unusual or atypical or divergent insights, right? Otherwise, everyone's going to invest and the price is going to go up, and that's what we just saw in this market.
Thank you.